Hi all, my name's Anne Pasick. Thanks so much for attending this talk today and for your engagement. This is research that got frozen in place when the pandemic started, so I'm both really grateful for the nudge to return to it now and highly interested in your feedback. But to get things started, I will begin with a kind of convoluted Zoom land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 20 in Peterborough, Ontario. And of course, our conference is hosted at the University of Alberta, which is in my hometown of Edmonton, which is part of Treaty 6. Additionally, because we are meeting together in part through Zoom, the data from this call is likely being stored and routed from Equinix data centers in Calgary, in Treaty 7, and in Toronto, which is part of Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties. So this is a growing and lengthy and probably not exhaustive list of all the territories and treaty relationships and expansive groups of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, all of which are imbricated in this effort, and all of which are historically and presently impacted by information and energy infrastructures that are in turn predicated on histories of colonial dispossession. As I'll return to in this talk, I think it's incredibly useful to think about the destabilizing potential of such recognitions beyond like gestures of simple gratitude or acknowledgement, and more so in the spirit of realizing how contingent the idea of Canada might really be. So let's start in March 2019, at the kickoff of the Albertan provincial election. Against the backdrop of Edmonton's Refinery Row, an assertively strong truck, and a poorly disguised 69 road sign, Jason Kenney announced the details of his party's fight back strategy for the province. If the UCP were to form government, he promised, a conspiracy of foreign-funded, mendacious environmentalists and economic saboteurs would be brought to heel by a new communications body. This institution would have a $30 million budget, and as an example, both of what Shane Gunster has described as extractive populism and symbolic nationalization, this entity would protect everyday Albertans by quickly finding and correcting false information about the fossil fuel industry on the internet and aggressively promoting its virtues. It would be something agile and assertive. It would be a formal institution, but one free of bureaucratic red tape. It would, connotating military surveillance and precision, be an energy war room. This promise would help Kenney win the election. Future Energy Minister Sonia Savage exclaimed that the War Room was the most exciting campaign promise for her constituents, while post-election focus group research argued that the War Room and its imaginary of forceful defense was key to the UCP's historic victory at the voting booth. However, details about the War Room were initially few and far between. It wasn't until December 11th that the initiative was formalized as the Canadian Energy Centre, to be led by former post-media journalist, scab, and failed political candidate Tom Olson. In the course of announcing the centre, Kenney emphasized how traditional government communications are too slow-moving and risk-averse. The Energy War Room, by contrast, will be a fully staged, rapid response space equal to the temporal rhythms of the digital communications era, and also the kind of insurgent forever war that social media had brought to the public sphere. Here again, the War Room was imagined through a kind of counter-terror logic as a space of exception and strength in a war of words and ideas waged by the state on behalf of private corporations whose interests were taken to be synonymous with those of the wider public. The Canadian Energy Centre, however, has failed to live up to this fantasy. From its wholly unimpressive materialization as an open concept office, to repeated plagiarizations of its logo, to inappropriate accusations that the New York Times is a failing and anti-Semitic publication, or its staff misrepresenting themselves as independent reporters, the War Room has proven to be a highly embarrassing liability for the Kenney government. It has neither improved the credibility of the province in the eyes of international investors, nor can it be said to have meaningfully intervened in social media debate, given its incredibly mediocre subscriber numbers. This, of course, raises questions of how we should go about framing a serious study of a boondoggle. I think it's fair to say that in public discussions of the War Room, we're apt to kind of approach it as farce, right? And therefore is a sort of exceptional case, both in its excesses and in its deviation from the norms of what we take to be effective state communication and also ideals of good government. However, I think that this approach limits what we can perceive about the conditions that brought us to the War Room. and the many significant and worrying continuities it poses across the longer history of Albertan and Canadian communication initiatives and their social promise. So I'm going to stop making petty digs, and I'm going to suggest that going forward, we should think of the war room as an infrastructural imaginary, one with long-reaching histories and a cultural appeal that conditions how state control and force is imagined to work through mediated systems of information and command, as well as what the martial connotations of this imaginary might mean in the context of a province like Alberta, a province which lacks the legal and practical means to live up to the strength the war metaphor implies. In short, I want to study the war room as an election promise and a popular fantasy. I want to understand why that fantasy was so appealing. And I want to understand why communications infrastructure, at this moment, seemed poised to resolve several contradictions in the political project of the UCP government and the articulations of its political base, and perhaps even those of the settler state as a whole. A first and important intervention to this end is to recognize all the ways that the Canadian Energy Centre's mandate was really like nothing new. There are numerous precedents to the idea of a proactive government-led PR campaign for the industry, from the previous Notley government's pro-pipeline ad buys to the federal conservatives' diplomatic outreach efforts in Washington. The specific social media logics of the war room are, of course, an extension of long-running industry and petroturfing efforts to sort of create, again, this permanent campaign of media outreach on Facebook and Twitter. And here I'm indebted to and warmly recommend the really excellent work by Jordan Kinder, Sheena Wilson, Tim Woods, Patrick McCurdy, and so many others who have documented the ongoing rhetorical and network logics of these mediated struggles over public opinion, all of which have resulted in what Moffat et al. Have called a discursive gridlock on the issue. And so it doesn't seem likely that the UCP could meaningfully expect that the war room would be able to break that gridlock through the repetition of old tactics. Instead, I think that the use of this campaign promise was to ignite wider social fantasies about the militarization of communication or of control through the creation of new state information infrastructures, right? Like that seems to be the promise. And of course, this means contextualizing this current moment within the wider colonial history of the province and the nation. Here, I'm interested in rereading work by James Carey, Harold Innes, and Deborah Cohen, who take infrastructure both as an object and a method of inquiry into the logics and tactics of settler states. This is especially revealing in the context of weak states, which can be usefully sort of reread in a deflationary sense, particularly in contexts like Canada, where Confederation was, and in several meaningful senses, um, like less a nationalistic expression of ideals than simply the means by which to secure capital for the intensive logistical and communication infrastructures required by private global industry. The settler state, in other words, has a long and definitional history of serving private capital by building infrastructure, supposedly for public benefit, but with very questionable public return. Another way to state this, as the kids are saying today, is that Canada is fake, right? Historically more a case of three resource extraction companies wrapped up in a trench coat than a like real state, driven by civic values or the domestic interests of its population as a whole. And here, borrowing from Laurie Atkin and Ed Schaffer, I think we can productively extend histories of the kind of staple economy critique to think of Alberta as a kind of staple state inside a staple state, and therefore a particularly acute site at which these contradictions and fakeness emerge. And quite interestingly, the paradoxes of weak states and their deference to private industry is also entwined in the history of the war room concept. The first war room emerged through a reform of British intelligence practices at the turn of the 20th century, in which telegraphy provided a way to reduce the cost of naval defense and to increase protection of British shipping interests, all by coordinating the movements of a much smaller fleet of ships with greater precision. Communications infrastructure, in other words, strengthened the military efficiency of empire while also papering over maybe like a growing financial crisis at its heart. And more recently, the concept has been extended and entrenched in political contexts where it describes spaces of informational monitoring and maneuver within electoral campaigns or increasingly during the permanent campaign that occurs during or at the cost of governing itself. So the war room here acts as a kind of anti-democratic surround to invert and reimagine Fred Turner's concept. It presumes to exert control through the multimedia capture of enemy tactics and information so that responses can be immediately and centrally dispatched. Again, there's a motivating thrift to this ideal, presuming that an abundance of screens will allow information to be quickly vetted by the few, rather than requiring the much more expansive labor of collection and deliberation by the many. To force this thought somewhat hastily to a close, where this all leaves me is contemplating how the idea of militarized information really looks like an attempt to resolve the contradictions of a government that sees itself both as a strong defender and a beleaguered victim, to claim the legitimacy of the nation state, but with only the resources of the province. Media presents itself as a means to both act aggressively and antagonistically towards a spatially inchoate enemy, and yet also to not act much at all, to never need the resources to fully back up this speech with force, which would require a much stronger state. But I'm interested in how media and energy infrastructures have played similar compensatory roles for one another within much longer histories of settler colonialism, both in the founding conditions of empire and as the insufficient ingredient to wholly secure the legitimacy of the nation. And so I want to end by asking, which of the contradictions displayed by the Canadian Energy Centre might be said to be specific to the UCP and therefore can be rightfully interrogated as an illiberal affront to the public sphere, and which are perhaps more fundamentally intrinsic to the settler state as a whole. So I'll end there. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our discussion. Cheers all.